second video about the lesson, the assertion of the state in France in early modern times. So we are still in part 1a, and in the previous video we saw how under the reign of Francis I, a centralized state started to be built. And in this new video I will deal with the fact that the king had to deal with his subjects, and so he could not impose everything he wanted. As I said in the previous video, well, of course, every people in France were his subjects, the subjects of the king, and he ruled over them. But some of them were more powerful than the others. In fact, a very tiny minority, the nobility, and one institution, the Catholic Church, had also a great influence over politics. And the king had to deal with that. You may remember that we saw that graph in the previous video, but I only showed you the left part of it. On the left part you can see the King's Council. Of course, we are here talking about what is called central government on the screen, and I would also call that the top level of the state. Okay, just around the king. Which people did the king rule with and helped him making his decisions? So on the left you have the council and the ministers, by the way, which were people that were chosen and appointed by the king, and he had a total freedom of choice. But on the right side you can see the presence of some grand officers of the crown. These people were not creations of Francis I. They were already there. All these great offices, in a way, belonged to some families of what we call the high nobility. You see, the most prestigious and powerful nobles in the kingdom. The king could choose to give one great office to one nobleman or the other, but there was also a huge dimension of tradition, and once you had one of these great offices, you had it for life. So that was I would say, a legacy and a remain of the feudal system of the Middle Ages. The king had to govern in accordance with the high nobility of the kingdom. And so if I take only one example, when Francis I arrived in power, he appointed Charles de Bourbon as connétable. This was the title of the leader of the royal army, so an extremely important function in the state. And if I chose Charles de Bourbon as an example, it is because later in history, Charles de Bourbon would betray the king. That's an example of divisions and lack of loyalty that could exist between some nobles and the king. An example of conflict, in fact. So here you have an example that illustrates the fact that the power of the king, notably under Francis I and many of his successors, in fact, this power of the king was not absolute. Okay? The king had to deal with the nobility. In fact, dealing with the nobles did not only mean being opposed to them. Of course, it was also a way to have allies if you got along way with some nobles. And in these decades of the building of the modern state, and that would be true until with the 14th and some others, the nobility increased in number, not greatly, but significantly, because some people could become nobles if they bought something that we called an office. And so the king could sell offices. That was a source of revenue for the state. An office was a function in the state that rich people could buy, and they became a nobleman this way. So they had to be rather skilled and educated, which was the case of the nobility in those days. But once they were officers, well, they owned this office, and that was them. And so they had a tiny piece of power. It could be a function, an administrative function about taxation somewhere in the country, for example. So you see, once you had an office, and as the king had to sell offices, it meant that he knew he had to deal with the nobles and give them what they wanted and accept that they had a certain influence. So again, not an absolute power for the king. For example, you could buy an office in order to be a member of a parliament. So here, one very, very important point of vocabulary. Parliament is absolutely one of the most important political terms that you must learn. If we consider the term parliament today, for example in Britain, parliament is the assembly, in fact two assemblies, that represent a nation politically. And most of our political regimes today are parliamentary regimes, which mean that the representative of the people, in a way, they have the power. That was also that is the British way originally of explaining what a parliament is. Okay. In France, during the early modern times, there was not one parliament for France. There were several parliaments in the kingdom, because what was named a parliament was not a representation of the people at all. All the members of parliament were nobles. In fact, once you were a member of parliament, of one parliament, you were a noble. And the parliaments were originally courts of justice. They were tribunals. And they imposed justice, they made justice in the name of the king. But they also had a role in the making of the law. And here it's a bit complex. I will show it with a chart. So on top of the state you have the king. Okay. And we already saw that the king made decision in accordance with the king's council. I mean, he had the final word, of course, but he dealt with them. Okay, I make it simple. And then the law was made. But in order to make a law, they could be called edicts or ordinances, etc. You need to have skilled people writing it, and you need to impose it at different levels of the kingdom. This is where parliaments, the courts of justice, had a role to play, because the role of parliaments was to record all the laws, to register them, to write them, actually write them in registers. And doing this, the parliaments in France had a right to contest a law, to say the king, well, His Majesty must recognize that there is a problem with this rule. Okay, you see what I mean. This was called droit de remontrance, the right of remonstrance in France. It did not mean that it was a democracy, not at all, but it was a limitation of king's power. Eventually, the king could impose his will by going to the Parliament of Paris, which was the most important one, and imposing his will, okay, by his presence. That was an event called lit justice, and it happened sometimes. In fact, the painting of the Parlement Paris that is here is a lit de justice. There is no English expression for this. So you have the king entering the Parliament of Paris and trying to impose his law. Well, anyway, the existence of these parliaments are a proof that the power of the king was not absolute. And it was also a good illustration of the fact that even though the feudal system was largely not destroyed but less important than in the Middle Ages, the nobility still had a certain influence on the affairs of the state, which is also a good definition of politics. Anyway, Francis I was also a prince of the Renaissance. He is remembered for being a huge supporter of arts. I like to compare these two paintings, two portraits made by the same painter, by the way, called Jean Clouet. This is young Francis I when he became king in 1515. On this portrait he looks like a medieval prince. But he is more remembered by a later portrait, also made by Jean Clouet, where you really have the prince of the Renaissance, and there is no direct representation of a crown, but the crown is somewhere. You can see it in the background on the wall. There is no real representation of military power here, but in fact you can see that the left hand of Francis I is on his sword. But anyway, you have here a good symbol of how much Francis I was the first king to support Renaissance arts in France, and he played a very important role at this level. The point I want to make about art here is that Francis I, and all kings actually, used art as an element of propaganda. And this portrait of him, which became so famous, was in a way also the official portrait of the state. And it was largely reproduced in more simple drawings, in engravings, so that the face of the king could be everywhere in the kingdom. I mean, Roman emperors used to do that in the past as well, so that was not totally new. But what is maybe new with the Renaissance is that it was not only the symbolic face of the king on coins and stamps and everything. It was really the face of this man, Francis I. And I think it's a good illustration of how power became a bit more personal for the king at that moment. So anyway, Francis I made a huge propaganda. When he had the Chateau de Chambord built, I'm not even sure he saw it completely finished, but building castles, royal castles, was also a way to build monuments celebrating the king. It is in the Loire Valley, Chambord Castle, as you may know, because in those days the king was not always in Paris, not at all. The court of the king was always traveling, and in particular in the Loire Valley, which was a place of with a nice environment, and kings of the Renaissance used to love that. So if you visit the Chambord Castle, you will see everywhere in the castle some symbols of Francis I, the F, and also this legendary animal that we call the salamander, which is a symbol of this king, Francis I, salamander with the crown. You can see it. That is a monument of propaganda. I mean, it's a way for a king to say, I'm here. And another famous example is the Louvre. The Louvre as we know it today, the eastern part of the Louvre, which looks like a square, was built under Francis I. There was already a castle there, but he had it totally rebuilt. So to show his presence is in Paris. And there is another castle which is strongly connected to Francis I. It is Château de Fontainebleau. It's near Paris. And here you have an interesting place which is called the King's Gallery. We call that La Galerie François Ier, which was made by an Italian artist called Le Rosso. And it's a very complex place with a lot of sculptures and paintings. But it's a celebration of the king's power. You can see, for example, here in Fontainebleau, this painting by Le Rosso, which shows King Francis I dressed like a Roman emperor. So a good symbol of power. You may think that this propaganda could not reach the common people, and you were right. I mean, only noblemen used to visit castles like this. It's true, but don't forget this. Political affairs in those days did not involve the common people. So this propaganda was clearly to impress the nobility and impose them with the vision, the image of the king. And the common people, they used to like the king anyway, because this is how they had been educated. They often liked the king and less the nobles, by the way. And so going back to this illustration of Francis I, I would like to say one word about this other rather famous painting, because it shows the king on a visit. Here he's entering Paris with another foreign monarch, by the way, and you can see the court and the army, and that kind of event was rather frequent. Kings used to travel their kingdom in those days. There was no TV, there was no very few newspapers, and traveling the kingdom in order to be seen, to meet the subjects, was a way for kings to impose their influence. Often when they visited cities, by the way, they granted cities with what was called privileges. That was a way to, a privilege was, for example, to pay less taxes for a city or to have a certain autonomy. And, you know, it was a deal. I give you a little autonomy, I reduce your taxes, and in exchange, you will be loyal to me. That was basically the way to obtain loyalty. So, try to follow me. What I mean is that kings in those days used to accept to not to have total power directly, and give some autonomy to cities, to nobles, in order to get their loyalty. Okay, this is the reason why you had this system that you know that the church and the nobles, they did not pay taxes. That's part of the basic political deal before the French Revolution. You have this elite that forms a system of privileges, and this is why used to stick them together. Okay, the king gave privileges to the nobles, and they ruled the state with him. Okay. Well, this loyalty was not always total, and that is the reason why Francis I is one of the kings that confiscated some lands to the lords, and so he increased what we call the king's lands, le domaine royal en français, the areas where the power of the king was stronger because the land was not owned by other lords. And you can see on this map an enlargement of the king's lands. In green you can see the new areas, and by the way you will also observe that the borders of the Kingdom of France were smaller. I mean, the territory was smaller than what it is today. Anyway, one last point in this second part, the king had to rule in accordance with his subjects. That was the title of part 2. It means that by his subjects, I mean the other people or institutions that had some power. And so one of the events, and it was also an institution, it did not exist all the time, but it was sometimes called by the king, was the Estates General. En français, les États Généraux. You may have heard it when you studied the French Revolution in the past. Estates General were an assembly not exactly of the people of France, but an assembly of the 3 estates of the realm. Realm is another way to say kingdom. So the 3 estates, the 3 orders. The nobility, here in the top left, the clergy, in the top right corner, and what used to be called the third estate, le tiers état en français, so representatives of the people that were neither nobles or clergymen. And when the Estates General were called by the king, it was often in order to discuss about new taxes. Okay, so Estates General proved that the king did not have absolute power. That's another proof. And by the way, the last Estates General would be called in 1615. Then it would be another period of royal power that we call absolutism. And so we are not there when we talk about Francis I and Henry II. Okay, I get done with this part. Let me finish with part 3, which would be a bit smaller. The state, and so the king, because the king was the state, had to exist at the international level. This is also true today. Today, the existence of the state is only true if other states in the world recognize its existence. You have today some countries that are not officially states because nobody recognizes them, or at least not everybody recognizes them. For example, today you have Taiwan, which is not recognized as the real state. The official name of Taiwan is Republic of China. It claims to be real China, if you want, and the United Nations, they don't recognize that it is a fact. Well, anyway, let's go back to the early modern times. States had to be recognized, and the states they must define their relations with the other states. This is what we call the foreign policy, les affaires étrangères en français. Something that is important is that before the 19th century, what gave the state its basis of existence was the king or the prince, not the nation. This is something extremely important if you want to understand something to politics before the French Revolution. A state was not a nation, because nation means the people. A state was a monarch, a king or a prince, a duke sometimes. Okay, and so the consequence of that was that family relations were extremely important in foreign policies. International relations were often based on family alliances, and this was not about to change. This was still true largely during the 19th century, in fact. Kings had their daughters marrying other princes for matters of geopolitics, to make alliances. And the Queen of France was often the daughter of a foreign monarch. A bit later in history, you have Catherine of Medici, who was an Italian princess, and she became Queen of France. And Francis I, what is interesting is that he was married to Claude de France, who was the possessor of Brittany. And so when she died, she's dead. When she died, officially Brittany was united with the Kingdom of France. It only happened in 1532. That's just an example of how family relations were part of international politics. But the big issue, the big rivalry that existed in Europe when Francis I was the king was the rivalry between France and another monarch called Charles V, Charles Quint in French. I said the relation between France and Charles Quint, but in fact I should say the relation between Francis I and Charles V, because, again, the king is the state. So, Charles V used to be Holy Roman Emperor, which means that he was at the head of an empire. That was the legacy of the Roman Empire, but in the early modern times it only ruled over Germany, actually. Italy was outside of his reach. Anyway, but what is remarkable is that Charles V, for family matters, he was also King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, Lord of the Netherlands. In other words, he could have been the emperor uniting Europe. At one point it was his objective. And you can see on this map, in orange, all the direct properties of Charles V. And if you had the entire Roman Empire, Holy Roman Empire, you can see that France felt encircled by Charles V. In any case, the French foreign policy at that period was to try and increase French influence in the north of Italy. The north of Italy was very divided. It was not a kingdom. It was divided into small republics and duchies and everything. Okay, and so there were many Italian wars that were fought there by France, by Francis I and also some of his predecessors. And this is when the Battle of Marignan happened. It was a French victory, the Battle of Marignan, in 1515. You may know that it is a famous date simply because the numbers are funny. So that's an example of one of the Italian wars. It was a long rivalry between the two, I said, with some examples of peace. This painting here represents a peace that was signed, I think, in the 1520s. No, it's not really important. Well, so France believed that for family reasons, for dynastic reasons, it had legitimacy. It could claim to have some places in northern Italy, and they wanted the Duchy of Milan in particular. And well, these wars took place for a while. In the end, war was too expensive, and so a bit after Francis I, under the reign of Henry II, a famous treaty of peace was signed in Europe. It's known as Peace of Cateau-Cambrésis. It's a city in the north of France. It was signed in 1559. And it was signed between France and Spain, very important, and also between France and England. And it's a very important treaty because more or less it brought peace at the international level. The reason why I'm talking about foreign policy is this one. Kings waged wars because they wanted to exist at the international level. And the wars of the King of France played a great role in the building of the modern state because fighting a war was costly. And so for paying the army, it implied to raise more taxes. And to raise more taxes, you needed to have a state administration, a stronger one and a respected one. And so paying for the war was an important fuel of the building of the modern state. And you see, this is when the state budget started to be calculated. And you see with this graph how much from this moment on it was about to be difficult for the French state to have a positive balance in its finance, because war was always very costly. But in any way, fighting wars was one of the reasons why the strong state started to be built under the reign of Francis II and Henry II.